Good morning and welcome to UK Column viewers and listeners. I'm delighted to be back in the studio today. My guest is Leon Krier, the esteemed architect and urban planner, who did an interview with me only really a few days ago. But we both found our interaction so interesting. I asked Leon whether he would be prepared to do a second interview, and he said he would. And so today we're going to delve deeper into matters to do with cities and architecture and planning. And we're going to try and perhaps delve a little bit further into why this process is now controlled and maybe who's controlling it. So first of all, Leon, I'm going to welcome you into the UK Column studio. Well, into the link anyway. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to be back.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this. Now, many of our viewers and listeners say to us, we need some uplifting things. And one of the points that you and I were discussing last time was about beautiful architecture and cities. And I pondered on this and I thought, what city would I like to put on screen? And I decided to choose Florence, Italy. And so this is just a generic photo of the city. I'm going to ask you for your comment on it, but I went there many, many years ago when I visited La Spezia in Italy with the Navy. While we were there for that visit, we got the opportunity to see a little bit of Italy, and I had the opportunity to visit Florence, and I was just fascinated with it. I felt it was a beautiful city. I was particularly taken with the general setting, the geographical setting of the city. But it was all those lovely terracotta red roofs and the buildings. And even though it was all packed in together, when you were in the streets, I still found it an attractive setting. So I'm going to throw this back to you. I chose Florence. Actually, I've got another shot of it here. This one with a substantial square in the middle, and we can see a change in some of the architecture. But I've got happy memories of this place, and to me, even though many people would say, well, that's a pretty crowded city landscape, to me, it was wonderful. What's your reaction to my observations?
Well, I think it's not just your observation, it's a general feeling. That's why it's one of the main tourist attractions in the world. And I remember when I was a kid, my first grand tour through Italy, I wanted to study Romanesque churches in Tuscany. And I went through Florence because it's unavoidable. And I got so attracted by Florence that I stayed there for a week. I hadn't been there since my parents took me there. But Florence, it's very interesting because, it's a great city. It has fantastic 19th century suburbs, and the rest is garbage. It's really horrible. And if you take Florence, you take away the center within the walls, just replace that by a car park. The biggest part of Florence is outside the walls, and it's horrible. And so I always said this as an example of where the value lies, where not only the, let's say, the real estate value, but also the spiritual value, the aesthetic value, and also the retail value is in an area which is really urban as compared to suburban. And I was in charge of planning Novoli, a huge quarter of the ex-Fiat land. And I had been commissioned by the mayor then Morales, whose chief assistant was Giorgio Pucci, who was the founder of Tuscan Greens. That is when the Greens were still green, really interested in culture and nature instead of making wars around the planet. We, for 6 months, it was able, with a very small junta of the mayor, to plan a perfect urban quarter, which was the size of historic Florence, replacing the factories of Fiat and Carapelli and so on. But then the mayor lost or retired, and the elections were won by socialists, and they called my plan, it was called on the newspaper, La Nazione, Il piano Krier fa schifo. Krier's plan is, four-letter word. Unprintable, but in Italian printed out, fa schifo.
Right.
And now it's built and it's disgusting. The park has become a kind of, they put a huge car park under it and so on. Whereas Florence, 2,000 and more history, has the most interesting architecture which can be described and codified with one page. We had one page to recommend the new architecture, and it would have been perfect. And there you see how important politics are, because that would be welcomed by the public and by the people in general. But because politics is controlled by very few intellectuals who are kind of terrorists, who don't think that people have the right taste, and they should be converted to so-called modern. I mean, we are as modern as them, just look at the dictionary. But they pretend that they have the only legitimacy to design, whereas doing traditional architecture would be considered illegitimate and therefore not modern, which is just a lie. It's even, dictionary-wise wrong. And I did in Italy something like 60 projects, and there's only one in Alessandria, which was because there was kind of an agreement with the mayor and a fantastic developer was able to do a scheme which was really respectable and which is like a piece of Italy. And but that is when politics is so completely controlled by a very small group of perverted people who have absolutely intellectually they are zero. They never debate. They don't confront me. They don't dare have an open discussion because they can't argue. They're just dictators. Whereas we have arguments to justify why we do traditional architecture. It's a rational choice and also a choice of the heart, because that's what everybody likes, this kind of architecture.
This is a very interesting point, and a little bit later I was going to get on to the subject of the planning system here in UK at least, and we'll share with the audience a little bit of who's got a finger in the pie, who's helping to control what happens in our city. But as an opening, thank you very much for that. That was Florence anyway. You chose a piece of video to get people interested in the subject, and I watched this with great interest. It's very short, it's very to the point, so let's play this little clip and then we can have a chat about it.
Architecture changed completely, and it went from designs that complemented the landscape around them to a kind of architecture that clearly hates people, that is designed to oppress the human spirit and make people feel without value, worthless. I think if you brought someone from the streets of Tokyo to the Cotswolds and said, what do you think of that building? He would say, that's beautiful, because beauty is inherent. Every person recognizes beauty. A Shinto temple in Kyoto, I recognize it immediately as beautiful, because it is. It's consistent with the symmetry of nature.
Municipal and state buildings were once plainly an expression of a contract between the people and their government of a good faith relationship.
I think that. I just thought that. I walked up with my wife in the rain on a village hall, and I thought, whoever built that cared about the people. It was built by the people who live there for the people who live there, and they loved the people who live there because they were related to them or knew them. It was built by peasants without machines.
Well, I'm smiling having watched it. I've watched it several times and I love it because it's just so short and sharp, emotive and fun. What made you choose this clip, Leon?
No, because I followed Tucker Carlson now for 3 years, because I have most of my work is in the United States. Whenever I mention to my clients, do you listen to Tucker Carlson? They say, oh, but he's so radical. I say, but I'm much more radical than Tucker Carlson. No, Tucker is a very interesting person and has enormous charm, and therefore he is also hated very much by middle class, sort of upper middle class intellectual America. But he already did 2 years ago. He did a 10-minute clip on his Tucker Carlson Tonight on federal buildings, comparing, you had on the left a modernist federal court and on the right a classical federal court building. And he had like 20 buildings which came like that. And it's fantastic. But unfortunately, it has been cut from YouTube. I can't find it anymore. It was still available within the Wall Street Journal did a real nasty piece about it. There you could still look into it, but it's gone. And no, he's excellent. And I'm surprised that even Russell Brand seems to agree.
Well, this is one of the things that really caught my attention. I haven't to date, for whatever reason, I haven't been a huge fan of Russell Brand, but in this particular one, he's clearly seeing something, and I'm totally agreeing, I think, with what he's seeing about the change in architecture. And I'm going to support him a bit further because having watched the clip, I just went looking for Russell Brand, and what popped up was a Guardian article. And this is the headline by George Monbiot, the journalist. I once admired Russell Brand, but his grim trajectory shows us where politics is heading. And then there's a sub-headline here. In an age of distortion, public figures have powerful tools and a responsibility. This is an object lesson in how that can go wrong. And we won't dwell on too much of the text, but it says that in 2014, The Guardian asked me to nominate my hero of the year. To some people's surprise, I chose Russell Brand. And then from there on, he absolutely slaughters Russell Brand and everything that he's reported, whether it's to do with the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, the Great Reset, Bill Gates, Fauci, the World Health Organization, whatever Russell Brand has been talking about, and those things are fact, they're not fiction, but The Guardian is very upset. So I'm going to, today, I'm going to put a marker down and I'm going to stick up for Russell Brand and say well done for that very interesting dialogue with Tucker Carlson. Now, you've also picked up on many other people. Well, of course, you've had a lifetime in this field, so you would. But you identified this man to me, James Howard Kunstler. And I went and had a look at his website. We've got an article, Situation Awareness. Now, most of that's about COVID-19. But down in the corner, I noticed a book. And if I bring that up on screen, it's actually a collection of oil paintings. But the front page, Beauty and Catastrophe, I thought was probably a pretty pertinent image for the sort of discussion that we're having today. But you've come across other works by James Kunstler.
Well, we are friends. He is one of the most interesting intellectuals I came across. He wrote the most important book, which struck me, is his The Long Emergency, which, like 25 years ago, described what would happen with oil peak. Talking about the limitation of fossil fuels, and that once we are over the peak, that people imagine took 200 years to get to the oil peak, but then there will be another 200 years of, to get to zero oil. And that is, his take was saying that once we are over that peak, we'll go into a situation of absolute catastrophe, because there will be a very powerful move to keep that oil, and for the very privileged and for the armies, but that the rest of the population will no longer be allowed to move as much as they are. And what he predicted, or what he described, is actually happening now. It's like it had been a book, a how-to for the future. And he was, of course, derided because he has a fairly flowery style, which upsets sort of the so-called well-educated. But Jim Kunstler is also part of the Congress of New Urbanism, who promote traditional architecture and traditional urbanism. He's a formidable person to follow. He has been no, he lives in the country, he has his own garden, he's ready for the catastrophe. He can nourish himself kind of self-reliably. There are many people like that, but what is, this Guardian article, what is so really menacing is that once the Guardian or the mainstream media disagree with someone, they condemn him rather than listen to them or engage them in debate. Because bloody hell, democracy is about debate, and those who pretend that they know they are more democratic than others are just lying. Because we are not born Democrats open to everything. No, we don't have to be plural. What is signal about democracy is it allows contrary convictions to govern or to shape politics of the future and to shape the environment. Now, that is another thing which Tucker Carlson talked about. There had been a Harris poll in the United States about really what federal architecture should be like, because it's one of the good things Trump did, was an edict that in the future federal buildings should preferentially be in a classical style. Now, Trump doesn't have great taste, but anyway, classical architecture is more than Trump. And the poll asked different American electors, the independent, the Republicans, and the Democrats, what do you prefer, classical or traditional, classical or modernist? And 73% of Republicans prefer traditional architecture. 73% of independents prefer traditional to modernist architecture. And 70% of Democrats prefer classical architecture to modernist. So it was the only subject 2 years ago which still unified America. This was in the middle of the Black Lives Matter and all the kind of gender nonsense. And so that would have been a subject to pick up by the great media, but only Tucker Carlson brought it to the great media. And Kinsler was also interviewed an hour long by Tucker Carlson, actually.
On the subject of what we prefer, classical or modernist architecture, I think we should bring the next image up on screen, because I had a visit to Scotland, and this is a photograph taken of me standing in front of part of the Scottish Parliament's complex. And I believe that this building contains what they call pods, which are for the Scottish MPs to be able to sit in their own little bedsit and work. But this is the building. If you go around the far side of it, it looks similar. Obviously, this is by the main entrance gate, which has got a security barrier. But as you walk around this building, certain sections of the outside wall are curved in a particular way in order to deflect blasts of explosives. But I looked at it, and to me it was like a camouflaged bunker, camouflaged military bunker. And I should have done a little bit more homework, because I've forgotten the name of the architect that produced
Miralles.
It was a Spanish architect, am I correct?
Yeah, Miralles. Yeah.
What's your reaction to this?
I hadn't seen that view, but that's even worse than what I imagined. I saw Miralles once present his drawings where he won the competition. When he won the competition, the drawings had nothing to do with an architectural project. He won. It was like a kindergarten production with leaves glued on paper, and he won the damn competition. It shows how perverted and completely decadent these juries are. They have nothing to do with architecture. But this view, bunkers are usually interesting architecturally. No, they have a kind of an interesting defense look, which is very masculine but powerful and also sometimes elegant. But this is just a terrible building. There's an Italian architect who said modernism is to make the easy difficult through the useless. And this is like the perfect illustration of this. I mean, architecture has been resolved in all countries for thousands of years. Rich and poor made beautiful buildings, whether it's in mud or in marble. And now, even with the most expensive materials, energetically, the most expensive building materials, we built this garbage. I mean, even the building next to the parliament is just horrible.
Let's bring that one on the screen. This is Portcullis House, which was built in order to give MPs more workspace. So we're talking about the building with all the so-called chimneys strapped on the top, but of course they're just features. And I've been in that building, and of course it's very oppressive the moment you go in, because you're forced through what is essentially airport-type security. Not a pleasant experience. I've labelled it the crematorium, because to me, that was the first thing that came into my mind when I saw it. If there was black smoke belching out of the false chimney stacks, that to me would have completed the image. So this is supposed to be part of the seat of our government. But when I look at the building, it's very dark, it's very oppressive. And interestingly, the tube station that serves that building was also built on a sort of industrial minimalist approach. And so unlike most tube stations, which are, at least some attempt is made that they are of a nice, light, bright design, the tube station has all of the metal airflow ducting is laid bare. It's cement walls with all the cabling and cable runs attached. And as I was travelling around the escalator, going from one level to the other, what came into my head was that I was in a chicken processing factory. It to me was also very oppressive. And for many years, I've wondered whether this is just my reaction to some of the buildings and architecture, or is it the fact that this architecture is being created in order to impose itself on people's minds?
Well, it's really pathetic, because it's next to one of the finest buildings in the world, an ensemble, and to do such an... Michael Hopkins, I think, is the architect. He normally does even worse buildings, but he was clearly trying to be a little more sympathetic to the historic fabric. But I call it architectural stutter. Rather than really learning traditional architectural codes and techniques, they try to do the impossible, to bring language or to bring messages into it's a dead language. No, because it's not something which is an authentic. I talk about authenticity, for instance, explaining why is traditional architecture authentic, because traditional architecture around the world and classical architecture use natural materials which are from the ground, from the climate, and from the soil, and from the altitude, to build structures which are stable. Now, to do that, you have to, if you use mud or brick, you have to shape brick so a hand can hold it, or a piece of stone which can be carried by maximum 2 or 3 people. And to fit these pieces of natural material into stable bonds, that is what is traditional architecture. It's a technology of building with local materials stable structures which protect you against climate, against erosion, and against intemperate situations. And whereas modernism is a product purely of synthetic materials, they are not natural materials. They are natural materials which are ground with high expenditure of energy into kind of malice or kind of flour, and then mixed with water and lime and all sorts of, and cement, becomes concrete or steel, whatever, And they are materials which are basically liquefied, and whether it's metal or concretes or plastics, they are liquid materials which you can then shape You can cast them in any kind of shape. But this liquidity doesn't tell you what to do. Whereas brick tells you what to do, how to do an arch. Because if you don't fit it correctly, it collapses. And even an idiot cannot build a bad arch because it will not stand up.
Yes.
And the arch, if it's logically built, they will be beautiful. And erosion and weathering of natural materials is always beautiful. Whereas concrete is a material which ages very badly, so you have to paint it or scrape it or whatever. Steel rusts and so on.
Yeah,
so it's a wrong idea to think that modernism is authentic because it uses synthetic materials. But synthetic materials, we built a whole town in Guatemala in concrete because seismic prescription, you cannot build in brick. It doesn't allow, because concrete needs to be it's a unified structure to not be shaken or thrown over. But you don't see it, because the only parts which you see, the cornices which are cast in concrete, or the paving stones, they get then hammered, martelinado it's called, push hammered, and they look like granite. But they're only small parts, either window surrounds or so on. So the idea that necessarily synthetic materials would dictate you a form is a lie, is a choice you have to take, what to do with these materials. And that is where modernism lies, because it's not more modern to do a straight lintel or an arch. You can cast them both.
Yeah.
The only advantage is that, for instance, even a cast arch in concrete is more solid than a straight cast lintel in concrete.
This part of the subject is just fascinating, and we could go on down there because I've got many questions. But if we're talking, as we are, about the architecture and the materials for individual buildings, I'd just like to bring us on to this wider thing about the form of cities and city planning. And you're going to have to forgive me, but I've come back to Mr. Abercrombie, who was the man I encountered in relation to the it was wartime development. It was 1943, after the bad German bombing of Plymouth, that plans for the reconstruction of the city were first considered. And then I think it was 1944 when they started to really develop it. And it was post-war when Plymouth Centre was rebuilt in accordance with a large part of the Abercrombie plan. Sorry, if we just put that one back on screen, thank you. So this was the Financial Times reporting on Patrick Abercrombie, the man who created London, because of course I'm talking about Plymouth because that's the plan I know, but he did many other works. And this was work that he did in, I think I can bring this up on screen a bit more. So this is the 1943 map showing how London would look based on, quote, social and functional analysis. And again, I'm going to ask for your opinion on this, because as we'll see in a minute, there's been some strong criticism of Abercrombie's work in relation to Plymouth. But am I right in thinking that this sort of social and functional analysis of a city, of an urban area, is part of the problem that design of cities has got into what you describe as the zoning? Is this where zoning comes from? Is it the work of Abercrombie, or have I got this wrong? Abercrombie was really a second-rate figure. I mean, he's never recognized even in the modernist Bible, to be any way of a precedent. He was just repeating formulas which had been published before. And what you see there, those blobs, what they are really, they could be misunderstood as being urban quarters, but they are not. Because they are zones they are colored in different colors, and they are either residential or retail or whatever. They are categories which zoning
the idea that the town should no longer be mixed use or made of small towns, because that is what's the lesson of history, that large towns, the good large towns, the great large towns, are always families of small towns. Even in London, one talked about old London to be a collection of villages of Kensington and Hampstead and whatever. And you still have in those in London the core, like Belsize Park, or these. You still have these remnants of pre-modern London. In Paris, these villages were developed into real urban quarters. But what the Abercrombie plan broke historically with that tradition of the large metropolis being a family of small towns and villages, and imposed a zoned areas which would be exclusively for what is prescribed, forbidding everything else. And it is this kind of zoning, that technique of zoning, which is the cause for modern congestion, because you have suddenly the whole population has to drive hours and hours in trains and cars and airplanes to do daily activities, whereas before you would generally within these blobs you would be able to walk everything, for at least for a week or a month, a day or a week, let's say. And the same system was applied. He still used some interesting architects like Lutyens, I think, did some sketches within the Abercrombie plan.
Yeah.
But the overall was disaster, and it was never executed really, because it would have meant to completely destroy historic London.
I've got another image of the Abercrombie plan. Now, this must have been an early conceptual drawing. It was labelled the City of Tomorrow. And just to set the scene for the viewers, the area around the words, the City of Tomorrow, that is water. And the dark protruding patch, which is just above the word tomorrow, that is actually the Lido swimming pool, which is, if I just move slightly, no, you can't quite see it, but it's directly behind me with the image of me on screen now. So this is looking, we're essentially, the view out of the UK column window is south, and the Abercrombie plan, if we bring it on screen, north is the top of the screen. So this is the city stretching away behind, to the north of me. And what was happening here was that there was very large damage from the bombing in many areas of Plymouth. And what happened immediately after the war is all the bomb damage was cleared. Many buildings that were felt unsafe were pulled down. And then the centre of the city was rebuilt with these very wide streets set out in largely a grid pattern. And there were supposed to be park areas built around it in order that the thing was a coherent plan. But of course, the usual happened. They said they ran out of money. So to be fair to Abercrombie, only part of his design was put in place and the rest was allowed to fade away. But if I bring this comment up on screen, now I've just used Wikipedia, but I think this one is fair. This is comment by Sir Simon Jenkins, and he says, "Poor Plymouth, it was badly blitzed in the Second World War and then subjected to slash and burn by its city fathers. The modern visitor will find it a maze of concrete blocks, ill-sited towers and ruthless road schemes. Most of this damage was done by one man, Patrick Abercrombie, in the 1950s. The old Barbican district, that's the area around the old fishing port, the old Barbican district would, in France or Germany, have had its facades restored or rebuilt. Here, new buildings were inserted with no feeling for the texture of the old lanes and alleys." Now, I've got to say, Leon, when I read that text, I know exactly what this man is talking about, because Plymouth in its heyday, pre-war days, when it was a very industrious city around a huge naval base and maritime construction industry, was a very busy city. It did have some very beautiful buildings, but it also did have what would be regarded as slum areas. But essentially, the Abercrombie plan produced something which many would say is the worst of both worlds. So I'll throw that back to you, because maybe I've been unfair on what was done here.
No, I think I'm amazed that Simon Jenkins is quoted by Wikipedia, because they are mostly modernist. They're supposed to be objective. No, Simon Jenkins is right, because the Abercrombie plan for Plymouth, the same happened in Dresden, socialist Dresden, or in the West Berlin, because the post-war period. Now, what happens when the town is destroyed? The families which survive want to reconstruct. Because if there is money available, and normally after the war there are kind of funds which are, whether it's a Marshall Plan or big banking loans, are being handed out to people to reconstruct industries. In fact, instead of that happening, one put a ban on the reconstruction of the lots. Because if you look at old Plymouth, you don't look at the buildings, but at the lots, building lots. You will see hundreds and hundreds of building lots of different sizes. Now, these would be either for residents, for craftsmen, for workshops, for monastery or whatever. There were several churches and so on. So it was a mixed use. And the slummy part was never one which was created to start with. Slums were in historical towns happened when there was an excessive use or the wrong use of the original building site, by either building too much or misusing what was maybe a craftsman shop to have polluting industries and so on. And so there was, instead of having a critical response to the industry or to the employment or to the complexity of what this town plan inherit, because bombs don't destroy the underground, or they used not. I mean, now they do. But in Dresden, for instance, the reconstruction of Dresden in the last 20 years happened on the old foundations, because the old foundations were still there. In fact, the services are still there. So instead of allowing the people, let's say the citizens, to rebuild their homes, they say, a ban, no, we must build a new town. What does that mean? Means not that one has a vision of a better society, a more modern society, because there are now different interests at political and financial interests which are operating. And so these post-war reconstructions were gigantic process of expropriation and putting together either into corporate hands or special corporate corporation like GLC or whatever the company was called in London, or what was called in Plymouth. And in order to create a new society, a new order. But for that, there was absolutely no experience, there was no experience or any real project how this society should look. When these were planned, for instance, until 1953 in Soviet Union, they were still done by extremely competent architects, or even by Nazi architects were still very competent. But rebuilding this new order. But in so-called democracies, there was a small group of intellectuals and artists and architects who really made a coup d'etat and destroyed the prestige of traditional architects. And therefore took over, because they said they are really over. I mean, they are part of they belong to the garbage a heap of history because they are reactionaries. And so it was an hominem destruction of the most competent. I mean, England had fantastic architects in the pre-war period still. No. Even modernists who did some charming buildings.
Right. I can add a little bit to your description there about what happened to Plymouth, because when you talk about the lots, I'm going to say the land parcels that were there after the war and as a result of the damage from the bombing, there were many of those land parcels that were actually, I'm going to use the word claimed by Plymouth City Council. They were parcels of land that actually belonged to residents of the city or families who were completely killed, wiped out in the Blitz. And Plymouth City Council then scooped up those plots, many of them. And locally, if you talk to older people, not so many of them about with the right age now, but they would actually say, Plymouth City Council destroyed more buildings than the Luftwaffe. So these are very interesting concepts. Now, I want to get to this subject about who is controlling local authorities when it comes to redevelopment issues. But before I go there, I wondered whether we could have a little chat about Prince Charles, or King Charles as he is now, because you've had the distinction of working with him very closely on the Poundbury development. And you also, in the interview that we did last time, you mentioned, of course, that he had spoken out about the quality of architecture. So I just wanted, I've chosen another Guardian article here. I should be told off, but never mind. They produced this report from some time ago. Sorry, I haven't got the date on it, but it is Prince Charles, and it's clearly stating what's happening here with the headline: Prince Charles's 10 principles for architecture, and then it says, and 10 much better ones. He's infuriated architects for more than 30 years, but Prince Charles's new set of rules for architectural practice might be his silliest intervention yet. So this is a pretty hostile article. It did, however, set out his 10 key principles. Developments must respect the land. Architecture is a language. Scale is also key. Harmony. Neighbouring buildings must be in tune, not uniform. The creation of well-designed enclosures. Materials matter. Local wood beats imported aluminium. Limit signage. Put the pedestrian at the centre of the design process. Space is at a premium, but no high rises. Build flexibility in. So that's what Charles was talking about when he was still Prince. And what is your response to those particular points that he made? Was he on the button with his criticism and his suggestions?
Well, they are self-evident and reasonable, commonsensical principles, and he's 100% right there. When he wrote his book called The Vision of Britain, 1988, I was asked to write a page on different themes, and the only theme because there was kind of committee of well-thinking people, I said there should be a fundamental principle: one shouldn't build higher than 4 floors, walkable heights. And that was the only principle which was not entered. But I see that in these principles, at least, there shouldn't be high-rise. Because high-rise, we are not against high-rise. And King Charles is not against high-rise. No, he's not against Big Ben or St. Paul's Cathedral. But the interesting thing about ancient, traditional high-rise is that they are generally one-story skyscrapers. St. Paul is a one-story skyscraper. So the limitation to building height, I think it's important to have a limitation of building heights, not metrically, but by number of floors, of usable floors. And I think if I was dictator, maybe God would elect me to be a dictator, what would I do? I would say, don't build higher than 3 floors, whatever height.
Yes, whatever height. Interesting. Yeah.
Whatever height, doesn't matter. Because naturally, commonsensically, it limits. For instance, what's interesting, in Florence, it's the difference. All buildings have 3 floors, or in Rome. Historically, they have 3, 4 floors. But the Palazzo Ricci is twice as high as the other, as the normal houses next to it, because they just could afford it. Huh? And it is this kind of limitation of practical points which I find we have to get back to and get rid of most legislation about building, because it's purely to employ bureaucrats. Huh? It doesn't improve cities. No, I think Prince Charles is, as far as architecture and town planning goes, is 100% right. And The Guardian, they hate that sort of thing. I mean, I have been called in The Guardian a racist.
Well,
a racist and anti-Semite.
We'll just bring this up on screen, because this is Douglas Murphy is actually identified as an architect. So this is an article that the paper has commissioned or bought in. And this is Douglas Murphy's response, where he's trying to put Prince Charles, as was, down on this one. Your home is not a castle. Architecture is not a language. Honesty is virtue. So we don't need to dwell on this too much, but this was a pretty vicious put down of the points that Prince Charles made.
Well, this guy clearly, I can't pick out any point. Building have no language. Of course, traditional building is a language, but it's a language not to tell you I love my mother or I feel bad. It's a language of construction. A traditional architecture itself is a technique of construction. Vernacular building is pure construction. There is virtually no character. The character comes through the use of materials and spans and openings and closures and pillars and so on. But classical architecture is a language because it uses the traditional elements of openings and lintels and so on, but makes them into elements which express more than just their use and makes them to objects of beauty. And why? Because public architecture is for basically public buildings. And in order for public buildings to stand out against the common, the economic fabric of the city, they have to be different in scale, but also in quality of material and expression. And in order for not just to be bigger size-wise, but also for this size to become aesthetic, it has to be adorned and to be a language expressing construction, not be pure construction, but also express construction. Like, the arch, when it is decorated, becomes a poem
yes,
of construction. It's not a pure arch. Or a classical column is a poem about a post. It's not just pure post, but really has a head and a shaft and a base, and it becomes really like a new invention expressing as a language for something which is more than pure construction. So it's transcending pure technology and becomes art, and that is why classical architecture is an art form of using traditional techniques. Mimesis is not mimicry. Mimesis, everything in nature is mimetic. Whatever we do is mimetic. And the modernists pretending that they invent anything is just lies.
Yeah.
Now, they say when we use classical traditional elements that we are mimicry. No, we are imitating arches in a technical way, and that is therefore becomes authentic of our time. Mimicry is when you repeat something without understanding. You repeat the word, but you don't even know the sense. If I had to read the Russian text, I would mimic it because I don't understand it. but that's mimicry. So it's just derogatory and useless for as principle.
Right. So this was a pretty hard response on Prince Charles and what he had to say, and you've essentially supported the key points that he made. But subsequently, we've seen Prince Charles go heavily into some of the agenda, which I would say is beginning to adversely affect society. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to policy edicts that have been coming through the World Economic Forum, for example. And the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, as an individual, is an area that King Charles, as he now is heavily involved in. He seems to me to have been drawn away from things to do. I'm being a little bit motive here, but I think this is right, with his own country and constitution and history. He seems to have become mesmerized by policy and ideas that have been coming out of the World Economic Forum. And yet many of those policies we see as, or I see as creating or wanting to create a world of a uniform nature. What do you think? What has caused the interest of Charles in matters to do with the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab? How has he got so enmeshed in this?
Well, he has been courted by these people for a while, and I wrote to him 2 years ago that he should dissociate himself from people like Klaus Schwab, who are clearly demented. I mean, they are psychopaths, and the whole UN climate change. It has nothing to do with science. It's political. It's a real collusion to get the world, create a kind of world government which will unify, with CBDC and surveillance and whatever the health passports, everything which is being prepared by the WEF or by the WHO or by Davos is, to my mind, criminal. And I wrote to him that he should dissociate himself because they are really a criminal lot, and that he was actually the only public figure who had dared stand against modernism, which was another collusion of this kind, of very few people against common sense and beauty and thousands of years of experience. And that maybe this would be the occasion to stand against. But he wrote back, this has too far gone, even I can't do anything about it. So I keep sending him material on, like, Bright Green Lies is a very important book by Derek Jensen and Larry Keith. They really analyze green policies around the world and demonstrate in how far they have nothing to do with green policies. They have to do with what they claim to be, what the modernists claim to be the fourth industrial revolution, which is essentially a script for world dictatorship. And I think that in that sense, I don't agree with him, and I think it's not good for him because he had built. I'm not a royalist. I mean, I have never been, and the point is that I think that he has, through his interventions about architecture and agriculture and those kind of, to have gentle policies of land use and construction, which was highly critical of existing policies. But for that to be monopolized by a very small group of extremely powerful people who want to build a world dictatorship, and I think there's no other word for it, a tyranny which is going to be the worst ever, and is bad because he had built a legitimacy for royalty, in that sense that he's no longer the head of the pyramid, but he is the kind of medium who mediates between the top and the bottom of society. I think it's really important to have debates about that. what the role of a king should be, and not ask Klaus Schwab, because I think they are really psychopaths.
Yeah.
And most governments who support these UN charters I think they are really psychopaths. There's no other word.
I would agree with that. Of course, we're not professionally qualified to call them psychopaths, but we can certainly believe they are, which I do. Again, we could discuss this particular area more, because getting into what a king should do, what the constitution should be, these are all inherent areas to do with nationhood and society. But can I just move us on again? One of the things that I've seen happen as some of this oppressive architecture has come into cities, I have seen very strange artwork appearing, and I've got a few examples which I'd like to pop up on the screen. This one, which is known locally as the chrysalis, was sent in to me. Now, I can't remember where it was in UK, but after I started to talk about strange and rather dark artwork, public artwork appearing, people would send me in pictures of what they saw, and this is one that was sent. And whilst there's a certain fascinating interest into what these objects are, that to me, there's inherently something slightly sinister about them. This is another piece of public artwork, Wicker Man. Obviously, it's in metal work. I believe that one's up in Scotland. This is one from England. So this appeared in the middle of a high street, and very quickly it was labelled the Wicked Willy. So people invariably recognised this as a phallus, and nobody was able to explain why it was put there, what the real purpose was. And I have found this to often be the case. If you see some of this artwork and you try and say, where did it come from? Who proposed it? Even how much was spent on it? Very often you don't get an answer. So this one, the local public, recognise it as a phallus. This one is particularly unpleasant. I've only got a shot of the top of it, but essentially this is about 30 foot high. It is a phallus, but the head of the phallus is a girl's face. And this is off of one of the motorways, and again, a member of the public sent it in to me. So I'm asking questions at this stage, and I'm saying I'm seeing this stuff and I don't like it, but I find it interesting that it's growing. This one I think is horrific. This is in Ilfracombe in Devon. So we've got a huge stainless steel, bronze and fiberglass statue of a naked pregnant woman. But if you were to go round to her right side, all of the skin is stripped away. So you look at her skull, you look at her rib cage, and you look at a baby still in the womb. If you look at the top of her right thigh, that's the skin hanging down, revealing all the muscle and sinews. And this was put up. There was a bit of a backlash about it. But in my opinion, this is not enhancing people's lives. This is introducing something rather unpleasant. And I'll just put alongside it an old one, the Angel of the North, which is another huge statue. People didn't like it at the time. You get a sense of scale in the top picture because there's a person standing relatively close to it. It's huge, but it's got a rather dark feeling to it. And if I come to Plymouth, this is called The Messenger. It's supposed to be a character from one of the plays that the Theatre Royal showed in Plymouth. You can see the scale of the lady in a yellow jacket and the bust behind it. So this is huge. And what it does, and it's dark, what it does is in my mind, it makes the human being feel very small and insignificant. This thing has a power of its own because of its sheer size. And this artwork is appearing in more and more places in UK, but it's also appearing in Europe. I know that in Belgium, there are some particularly unpleasant statues which have appeared in urban squares. And I don't know whether you've come across this, but to me, it's almost like there's an ideology putting its markers down, and how would I describe it? Boasting that it's started to take over our community, our communities, and indeed our architecture.
Yes, it's interesting that all these ugly and indecent pieces go very well with the indecency of the architecture, and it harmonizes in and competes in indecency. But it's the same around the world. Tom Wolfe wrote the book. I think he forget now the title of the book, but was against modern art, because it's not art. I mean, it's just statements, provocative statements who are supposed to make you think. But what does it make you think? It makes you depressed, to have ugly pieces. And he called it the turd in the square.
Yeah. So he knew what he was doing.
Oh yes, Wall Street or Fifth Avenue. Every big bank building has these disgusting pieces, so-called art. Has nothing to do with art. I mean, it shows the degradation of. There are still talent born. It's many great artists born, but they don't get these commissions to do to decorate bank halls and public squares in Plymouth. It's a mafia of, I think, people who are really indecent and perverted, somehow frustrated because an artist doesn't produce such a horror. I mean, he wants to do something which pleases and
is uplifting.
Well, because it pleases himself. When I do my work, I have enormous pleasure in drawing. And people who build my stuff, or who illustrate it, painters or graphic artists or renderers or then builders, they also enjoy their work. Whereas in this production of this garbage, nobody has any pleasure. I mean, I can't imagine. Or they are hypocrites. Usually these people, that's what Prince Charles always joked about, that architects, most modernist architects, live in traditional homes. I had actually written a series of articles called Private Virtue and Public Vice, which is where modernist architects live, including my boss, Jim Sterling. He always lived in traditional homes. And I told him, why can't we design buildings like your house? Oh, but that's, no answer.
Interesting.
And I had done illustrations. I can send you the articles. They were published in Brussels about Rome, about Paris, about Berlin, about Luxembourg. I forget now where else, and London, of course, because I was still living in London. And all the modernist architects, Foster, Rogers, Sterling, all these people. Only Hopkins lived in his own modernist house in Church Row. No, somewhere in a street in Hampstead, but it was in a traditional street. So whenever he came out, it was like good old Hampstead. It was not his own environment. Yeah. No, I think it's fundamentally modernism is hypocritical. And because I always say, I judge an architect's work by the Kantian imperative. What if the axiom which is behind the action of this building, behind the design of this building, became general law? What if all buildings of the street, of the quarter, of the town, of the country, of the continent, of the planet were built the way this architect designs? I mean, imagine the architect of the world vision of the architect Miralles of the Scottish Parliament. If this guy builds a whole town, a whole country, it's just a nightmare.
Yeah.
It's unimagined.
Absolutely. That place was just appalling. I'm going to move on again, if I may, because I wanted to get onto this subject of who is pulling the strings. And I thought one of the ways to do it is to look at how cities sort of formulate some of their foundation planning principles. I've chosen Plymouth because that's an easy one for me to do. Let's bring the Plymouth 2014-2034 plan on screen. So here it is. And to me, what have we got? Well, actually, we've got a map of the world. That's what I think the green circle and all the buildings, this to me is really something to do with the world. But then we've got all the things which Plymouth City Council is considering: the local community, green space and environment, arts and culture, economy, education and learning, getting around, living, housing, health and well-being. And if I just bring up for what it is, the list of policies, now we start to see that it isn't just a case that the people in Plymouth are deciding what their city is going to be like, because just look at all the policies we've got: creating the conditions for economic growth, using transport investment to drive growth, dealing with flood risk, minimising Plymouth's waste. It goes on. And yet this is the sort of baseline for how the city is apparently going to develop in the future. So the introduction here I thought was quite interesting, so I've just blown this up a little bit. It says the Plymouth Plan is a groundbreaking plan which looks ahead to 2034. It sets shared direction of travel for the long-term future of the city, bringing together a number of strategic planning processes. It talks about the economy, transport, housing needs, how the city can improve the lives of children and young people, how it can be healthy and prosperous with rich arts and cultural environment. I mean, everything is listed in there. Plymouth City Council is going to do it. And it went on, it says a radical agenda to, quote, transform the city. But as you read on through, we're talking about even more detail, including the effect of COVID-19. And the last little bit here, well, this starts to tell us what's really going on, because when you get to the end, we're talking about net zero city by 2030. And here we're clearly saying the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are forming the bedrock for this development plan for the city. So I'm just going to put a bit of a crude label over this. We've got centrally controlled plans for a centrally controlled life. This is not Plymouth planning its future, Leon. This is the United Nations telling cities worldwide how they are to structure themselves.
Yes, I think it is a criminal activity. It's criminal minds who are behind this, because even terms like zero carbon is total nonsense. I mean, I was together with a partner of Foster in a conference in Madrid, and he was the head of the zero carbon Masdar in Dubai, I think it is, of Foster. And after he said, "Oh, Leon, we share a lot of common ground." I said, "I don't see it all, because zero carbon is a lie." And he said, "Yes, well, ever since we started actually monitoring our buildings, we realized that zero carbon is not. I mean, zero carbon is not only impossible because you spend the carbon somewhere." To material, whether it's spent in China or here, it doesn't matter to the planet. And so it's first of all a lie. And carbon is not as bad as they say. It's not a problem, because there are many scientists who have calculated exactly what is the incidence of this 0 or whatever carbon in the atmosphere. It's not. There is no threat of carbon to the planet. And humans can, there's another form of hubris to think that we can actually change or save the climate. Climate is climate, basta. It has nothing to do with human pollution. Has to do with human activity, with polluting our lungs and our environment and our waters. That is certainly something we can enormously help. But to change the climate is just nonsense. It's lies.
Leon, I'm just going to reinforce, I showed Plymouth's plan on screen, but of course it's not just Plymouth. Let's take it up to county level. So here's the Devon County Council Plan 2021 to 25. Our plan focuses on how we will help the county to recover from COVID-19 pandemic, build on the resilience of local people and communities to create a fairer, healthier and more caring place, and grasp the opportunity to create a greener, more prosperous and inclusive future for us all. This is all dreamland. We've got a strategic leadership team, and I couldn't help labelling this as, are these the future leaders with a common purpose? But Plymouth City Council is a city in the grasp of Agenda 2030. Devon County Council is also captured. But of course, this is UK-wide, it's globally. But here's Luton Together. This is quite an old one, but I've had it for some years. The Council's Strategy for Transformation 2011-2014. And it starts off in a very depressing way, saying that it's all about change, but change can be difficult and mean difficult choices. We face difficult and uncertain futures. So the whole thing starts off in a very depressing way, but trust us, Luton Council, because we're going to transform Luton into a green, healthier, fairer, happier city. This is nonsense. And yet all of this agenda is coming through from the United Nations, and in particular those Sustainable Development Goals. And we know that it's not UK that's captured by this. We're seeing the same thing in the United States and throughout Europe. So this is, in my opinion, globalist policy to capture the whole of the planning environment around cities and even local communities. Well,
it's this kind of euphemistic propaganda which is really the most disgusting, because they know that they are lying, and they think. I once had the discussion with a theologian about arbitrariness. How arbitrary can power be? And that they can sell us a virus to be controlled by a mask. And he said, well, of course, this is on purpose, because power has to prove that it's not reason which controls the world, but it's us who control the world. No, whatever we tell you, you follow, and basta. This is no longer democracy. And that is what has reigned in corporations. And now corporations who have really COVID, the pandemic is really a corporate takeover of the world. It's very clear. It's destruction of small-scale industries and retail around the world. And yet it's sold as if it was all for our interest. And it's really preparing us to be forever prepared to live in a state of emergency. And that emergency can be declared, I mean, you talk about this either by the WHO or WEF, World Economic Forum or whatever. But they are globally linked and they are coordinated. And the COVID policy was a testing ground, and it worked extremely well for their part, but destroyed large segments of societies. And to sell this as if it was all for our safety is just lies.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there are very good documents, like I quoted this Patrick Wood, The Rise of Technocracy, is basically a criticism of UN 2030 policy, how that is really a plan to take over globally to destroy democratic society or whatever is left of it.
Yes.
And also these Bright Green Lies by Derek Jensen, they are formidable. To really call their bluff, because they are lies. I mean, like sending bombs to Ukraine for peace. How disgusting can you go as a politician? Annalena Baerbock, Foreign Minister of Germany. And to speak this language and say she doesn't care about her electorate. She cares about the people of Ukraine.
we're into another subject where there is so much. I'm going to say that I think we've come probably to a natural break point here. It's been really fascinating to go through these areas with you and to hear your comments and professional opinion on what's taking place with architecture and planning. I'm going to bring one image up on screen as a little taster, because I'm going to say straight away to the audience, I'm hoping that you'll come back and do a part 3 with me. I'm putting on screen one of the images you sent about some of your own work, and I think I'd like to give you proper opportunity to do that. But I think we must close today. Would you be happy to come back and do a part 3?
Absolutely, free of charge.
Free of charge. All right, that's wonderful. Well, I would certainly like to show the audience some of the image of those project images that you shared with me. That would be great to do. And also, I think there's a sort of section of this subject that we also need to cover, and that is that we could have a look at some of the images of these new super cities that are emerging. We've got a linear city, which is being built now in the Middle East. Yeah. I find these things. I'll use that word, scary. There's just something about them which is inhuman. But
they are criminal. I mean, there's no other word. They're crimes against humankind.
Right. Well, I think what we need to do is to show our audience what we're talking about and why we think there's problems. So if you're kind enough, brave enough to come back with UK Column for a round 3, that would be really lovely.
Great. Love to.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Brian.
We'll end there, Leon. Thank you very much for joining me today.
I hope you won't be shut down because of me.
I don't think so, but who knows? If we're shut down because of you, it will mean that we have a really fantastic video that will go everywhere. All right, we'll end it there. Thank you very much for joining me. Bye-bye.